In Japan, a woman's place in the family is like dirt. This woman merely forgot to put fruit in the fridge, yet it drew her husband's displeasure. He actually made her eat the rotten fruit. Kanako was incredulous. The next moment, her husband struck her. Her happy, peaceful Christmas was filled with her screams. The next day, her husband knelt before her, looking pitiful, begging for her forgiveness. Takeo promised it wouldn't happen again. Looking so wronged he seemed like the victim, but fear filled Kanako's eyes, terrified her husband might snap again at any moment. Still, she chose to forgive him. She blamed his actions on the stress of his recent promotion. She believed everything would be fine once she endured this period of his career advancement. Yet Kanako soon paid the price for her naivety. Breakfast not to his liking? Beating. Clothes not ironed properly? Beating. Bathwater too hot? He'd even force her under the water. Kanako's hands trembled as she recounted these events. Behind her, Miho seethed with rage. As Kanako's closest confidant, Miho couldn't stand idly by. She only blamed herself for discovering the truth too late. Outwardly, Kanako's husband appeared steady and magnanimous, portraying an image of perfect marital bliss. That day, Miho visited her home. During their conversation, Miho playfully gave her a light push. Kanako collapsed in pain, falling to the floor. She claimed she'd accidentally bumped into a cabinet earlier, but facing the scattered fruit on the floor, Kanako's gaze fixed on her husband. Her body trembled uncontrollably. Fortunately, Takeo didn't notice. This strange behavior didn't escape Miho's eyes. She sensed this couple wasn't as loving as they appeared on the surface. Worried Kanako might be under Takeo's coercion, Miho kept quiet and returned to Kanako's house while Takeo was at work. Kanako claimed she had the flu and feared infecting Miho, but her flustered demeanor made Miho suspect something was wrong. Noticing the bruises on Kanako's face, Miho asked if her husband had hit her. The frightened Kanako insisted it was an accident. Of course, this didn't fool the observant Miho. She noticed the wall painting had shifted position. Pulling it aside revealed a gaping hole, proof of the assault. Under Miho's urgent questioning, Kanako reluctantly confessed the truth. Kanako claimed her husband's actions stemmed from overwhelming stress. Everyone faces setbacks sometimes, she added. Miho retorted angrily. Hard work has nothing to do with domestic violence. She urged Kanako to divorce immediately. Living with Takeo would never bring happiness. Kanako pleaded with Miho to connect Takeo with some clients. Once he secured a promotion, her husband's volatile temper would surely dissipate. Seeing her persuasion futile, Miho reluctantly agreed to try Kanako's approach. The next day, Miho visited Takeo's bank to introduce him to major clients. But when she saw Takeo's bandaged right hand, a chill involuntarily ran through Miho's heart. In the end, she abandoned her plan. Even if she helped Takeo get promoted, it wouldn't change his abusive nature. Miho was so certain because her own father was a domestic abuser. He would beat her mother mercilessly over trivial matters. Young Miho could only hide with her sister in the closet each time. Her father's curses and her mother's pleas became the shadow of her childhood. That's why, upon learning Kanako was also suffering domestic violence, she felt such urgency to rescue her from the fire. Miho found Kanako again and urged her to get a medical certificate from the hospital. This cycle of domestic violence would never stop. Kanako said Takeo had sworn he wouldn't abuse her anymore. Miho reminded her that her own father had made the same promise, only to continue abusing her mother. But Kanako remained stubbornly convinced. Depressed, Miho confided in a client. She asked how a Chinese woman would handle domestic violence. The client advised fighting back, making sure he wouldn't walk away unscathed. A man who commits such violence has no right to live. These words seemed to awaken Miho. She sought out Kanako once more. Kanako now appeared utterly broken. Miho urged her not to trust Takeo's vows anymore, but Kanako had been beaten into complete submission by her husband. She dared not call the police or file for divorce, because doing so would only lead to even worse beatings. After hearing this, Miho suggested they escape together. Surely Takeo wouldn't chase them overseas, but Kanako immediately rejected Miho's idea, because if they did, her family would surely face retaliation. Seeing all other options fail, Miho recalled words spoken by a client. A bold idea then took root in her mind: kill Takeo. Kanako begged her husband to stop hitting her. pleading it as her birthday wish. Takeo slowly took his wife's hand and solemnly promised never to strike her again. He sincerely apologized to her. Kanako shed tears of emotion, yet the very next moment, after they finished dinner and returned home, simply because she interjected while her husband was chatting with a neighbor, Takeo dragged her by the hair onto the balcony the instant they entered. No matter how Kanako begged for mercy, her husband refused to let her back inside. Outside, a violent storm raged as Kanako lay helpless on the ground. It turned out that Takeo's solemn apology had been nothing but a lie. She gritted her teeth and endured the night. The next morning, when Takeo opened the balcony door, his wife was pale as death, nearly fainting, yet Kanako knelt on the floor, apologizing to her husband. Takeo responded coldly, "Go make breakfast." After a night of wind and rain, Kanako's body trembled uncontrollably, her hands refusing to obey her, but she dared not defy her husband's will. No matter how carefully she moved, her battered body still caused an egg to slip from her grasp and shatter on the floor. She glanced urgently at her husband. Thankfully, he didn't notice. Relieved, she knelt to clean up the mess. Once out of her husband's sight, Kanako could no longer hold back her emotions, yet even her sobs were muffled, not a sound escaping. Only after her husband left for work did Kanako finally dare to breathe freely, but she couldn't hold on any longer. Collapsing onto the floor, she mustered her last ounce of strength to call her best friend. After hanging up, Kanako passed out. When she woke again, she found herself moved to a bed. Miho watched her with concern. Kanako finally came to her senses and agreed with Miho's perspective. Her constant yielding only emboldened her husband to become more abusive. Miho was relieved that Kanako had come to this realization. Now it was time for them to fight back. Miho revealed she'd found a way to kill Takeo without getting caught. After Kanako rested, Miho took her to meet someone. To Kanako's shock, the man before them looked exactly like her husband. His name was Eiji, an undocumented immigrant. He also had a mother critically ill and in urgent need of medical funds. Without a passport, he couldn't get most jobs. Only the kind-hearted Mrs. Lee was willing to take him in, and he was the crucial piece in Miho's plan. Under Kanako's questioning gaze, Miho laid out the entire scheme. First, Miho would introduce a client to Takeo at the bank. Since the client suffered from Alzheimer's, Miho could easily transfer the client's money into Kanako's account. Then, they would create the illusion that Takeo had embezzled the funds. After that, they would find an opportunity to kill Takeo. After hiding the body, Eiji would impersonate Takeo to withdraw money from Kanako's account. Then Eiji would use Takeo's passport to flee the country. This would be framed as Takeo embezzling client funds and absconding. Since the sum wasn't enormous, the bank wouldn't report it to avoid reputational damage. This way, Kanako could completely escape her husband's control. Kanako couldn't hide her excitement upon hearing this. They first approached Eiji, stating that if he followed their plan, he would receive a large sum of money, which would provide for his gravely ill mother. Miho then outlined the tasks Eiji would need to perform. Eiji hesitated, questioning, "Why are you doing this?" Miho replied, "If you help, Kanako can be saved." Seeing Kanako's tear-filled eyes, Eiji seemed to understand her plight. He agreed for his mother, and for this pitiful woman before him. Now the three had reached an understanding. Miho initiated the first step of the plan. Under the pretense of helping connect clients, she brought Takeo to the home of an elderly client suffering from dementia. To facilitate transferring the client's funds, Miho suggested setting up online banking for future shopping convenience. The client trusted Miho implicitly and readily agreed. Meanwhile, Kanako located Eiji's residence. Though she knew the man before her wasn't her husband, Kanako still felt a flicker of fear at the sight of his face. Fortunately, Eiji's gentle nature eased Kanako's heart somewhat. She then had Eiji practice forging Takeo's signature, but having dropped out of school early, Eiji was even unfamiliar with the proper grip on a pen. Seeing the crooked scribbles on the paper, Kanako felt a pang of disappointment. Eiji promised he would practice diligently. That evening, Miho suggested that alongside practicing the signature, he should also begin mimicking Takeo's clothing and hairstyle. The next day, Kanako was astonished to discover Eiji's handwriting had improved dramatically. It now bore a striking resemblance to Takeo's signature. Just as she was puzzling over this, the floor covered in practice sheets revealed the truth. Hearing Kanako's affirmation, Eiji was overjoyed. Later, Kanako had him change into a suit. Seeing Eiji before her, Kanako's expression turned horrified. Eiji approached step by step. Kanako could only close her eyes. Countless scenes of domestic violence flashing through her mind. Just as she was filled with dread, the next second Eiji draped a coat over her. Though his appearance resembled Takeo's, his personality was worlds apart. Kanako styled Eiji's hair based on her husband's photo. The atmosphere grew awkward for a moment. She had to find a casual topic to divert the conversation. Noticing the list pinned to Eiji's wall, Kanako curiously asked what it was. Eiji explained they were his wishes. He wanted to cure his mother's illness and return to his homeland, drinking locally brewed white wine and eating snacks. Such an ordinary life was precisely what Kanako longed for. Eiji's preparations were nearly complete. Kanako and Miho drove to the chosen plot of land. They pulled out their tools and began digging tirelessly. The sunset rising in the distance lifted both their spirits. Kanako was deeply grateful for Miho's presence. It was Miho's courage and decisiveness that had given her hope for survival. Meanwhile, trouble arose for Eiji, who lacked a passport. As an undocumented immigrant, he had been targeted by the police. Returning from digging in the field, Kanako and Miho saw police cars parked along the entire street. Learning this situation, they sensed trouble. If Eiji got caught, the entire plan would fail. Kanako quickly called Eiji, but the phone was turned off. She rushed to his apartment to check. Fortunately, Eiji had evaded the police. He knew he now carried a greater responsibility. Just as Kanako breathed a sigh of relief, Miho called, urging Kanako to get Eiji out immediately. His residence was no longer safe. Eiji was then arranged to stay at a hotel, where he was advised to avoid going out. Fearing delays could lead to complications, the two decided to accelerate their plan. They set next Friday as the official execution date. Every Friday night, Takeo would come home drunk and pass out immediately. At Kanako's suggestion, they decided to strangle Takeo with rope once he was sound asleep. On the sixth day before the agreed date, Miho selected a box large enough to hold the body based on Takeo's height and weight. Meanwhile, Kanako was choosing sturdy rope. So engrossed in her task, she completely failed to notice Takeo beside her. Takeo asked what she was doing. Kanako quickly improvised, saying she was picking out rope for camping. Takeo walked away, half believing her explanation. On the fourth day before the planned date, Takeo left for a business trip out of town. To ensure nothing went wrong, they decided to conduct a rehearsal first. Miho stepped into the elevator as planned but forgot about the surveillance cameras throughout the complex. Kanako checked the community regulations and discovered the camera footage was only stored for 3 weeks. This was acceptable to them. Later, they brought the purchased rope to the bedside. Counting down from 3, 2, 1, they pulled with all their strength. They also retrieved the pre-purchased bag. To simulate realism, Kanako had bought sandbags matching her husband's weight. They loaded the sandbags into the bag and dragged it all the way to the underground garage, struggling to lift it into the car. This proved their plan was entirely feasible. With anxious and nervous hearts, they endured until the appointed day. Kanako arrived at the hotel, meticulously dressed for Eiji. Meanwhile, Miho arranged a lunch meeting with Takeo at a restaurant under the pretense of discussing work. While Takeo left the bank for lunch, Eiji would impersonate Takeo to withdraw money from the bank. The bank's security cameras would capture Eiji's face, solidifying the evidence of Takeo's embezzlement. But plans changed unexpectedly. Miho was suddenly assigned to a project meeting in Kyoto. Instantly sensing trouble, she quickly claimed she had other work, but a male colleague offered to cover for her, and the colleague assigned to accompany her to Kyoto was none other than Takeo's sister. If Miho continued to refuse, her unusual behavior today after killing Takeo would inevitably arouse his sister's suspicion. With no other choice, she reluctantly agreed. She then hurriedly called Kanako. Kanako decided to meet her husband for dinner herself. To buy Eiji time to withdraw money from the bank, Miho promised Kanako she'd return before tonight's operation. After arranging with Eiji, Kanako hurried to the restaurant where Miho and her husband were supposed to meet. Takeo was indeed waiting there. Seeing Kanako, he looked puzzled. Kanako explained Miho had to go on a last-minute business trip and couldn't make it. Takeo refused to waste time with her husband and stood up to return to the bank. Kanako had no choice but to grit her teeth and say she'd always wanted to eat here. feeling the stares of the surrounding diners. Takeo's face darkened, but he couldn't act. He could only seethe inwardly. This was the first time Kanako had ever defied her husband's wishes. Her hands were already trembling uncontrollably, but to buy more time for Eiji, she had to keep chatting with her husband. Takeo, however, grew increasingly impatient. Had it not been for the crowd, his fist would have already struck his wife's face. Watching her husband's utter disgust toward her, Kanako couldn't help but think of Eiji. Though sharing the same features as her husband, he was so kind and gentle. After seeing her husband off, Kanako hurried to the meeting spot with Eiji. Seeing Eiji had completed the task as promised, Kanako breathed a sigh of relief. She called Miho to report everything was going smoothly. Meanwhile, Miho had arrived in Kyoto with Takeo's sister, Akiko. During her meeting with the client, Miho's mind was elsewhere. The assassination plan was already set in motion. If she couldn't make it back as promised tonight, she dared not imagine how Takeo would retaliate against Kanako once he learned the truth. As the clock ticked late, Miho excused herself to use the restroom. Seeing only a 2-hour return bus left, anxiety gripped her. But Akiko, seemingly reluctant to end the evening, invited the client to another restaurant. Miho suggested postponing, citing concern for the client's health. Only when the client agreed to meet another time did she breathe a sigh of relief. Watching the client depart, Miho glanced at her watch again. This action aroused Akiko's suspicion. She demanded if Miho had plans with Kanako. Earlier that day, when Kanako had called, Akiko had glimpsed Miho's phone screen, but Miho and Kanako's conversation had seemed oddly strained. Now, with no time for explanations, Miho hailed a taxi and raced toward the station. Kanako had already prepared everything, waiting anxiously for her husband's return. Hearing the doorbell ring, Kanako took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm as she opened the door. Though Takeo was drunk, he hadn't forgotten his wife's earlier defiance. After he fell into a snoring sleep, Miho finally returned. The bruised eye sockets on Kanako's face were clearly Takeo's handiwork. This only strengthened the two women's resolve to kill, even though they'd meticulously planned everything beforehand. Their nerves were palpable when the moment finally arrived. They tiptoed into the room. Seeing the man sleeping soundly on the bed, they dared not make a sound. After retrieving the rope, they held their breath as they looped it around Takeo's neck. Unaware, Takeo lay there, his life about to reach its end. Gripping both ends of the rope, they began counting down softly. At the critical moment, Takeo's phone rang. The sudden interruption stunned them. Takeo also opened his eyes, dazed. The moment he sensed something was wrong, the two women gave the signal and pulled the rope tight. Despite Takeo's desperate struggles on the bed, the two women showed no mercy. As Takeo's breathing gradually ceased, Kanako reminded Miho not to slacken her grip. They strained every muscle, choking him for a full 3 minutes. Only after confirming Takeo was truly dead did they dare to let go. Once calm, they swiftly stuffed the body into a bag. Following their rehearsed routine, they dragged Takeo into the car. They drove straight to the wilderness, arriving at the pre-dug pit. Gazing at Takeo's stiff corpse, the usually strong Miho found it hard to bear. Kanako, however, remained eerily calm. Years of suppressed life under her husband's abuse finally found release in this moment. She felt no fear, only an indescribable lightness. After filling the pit, they scattered fallen leaves evenly across the ground, until no trace of disturbance remained. Unnoticed, dawn had broken. Rushing home, though the ordeal wasn't over, Miho couldn't help but feel joy for Kanako. After a brief rest, they headed out again to the agreed meeting spot. Once they met up with Eiji, all that remained was to safely get him out of the country, and this perfect crime would conclude smoothly. At the airport, Eiji listened attentively to their final instructions. Though mentally prepared, he couldn't hide his disappointment upon hearing Miho's words. After spending time together, he seemed to have developed feelings for Kanako, yet he extinguished those unrealistic fantasies within himself. Watching Eiji walk away step by step, Kanako couldn't help but chase after him to express her gratitude. They bowed deeply to each other. That bow held so much unspoken affection. Kanako felt a deep melancholy within her. This man's kindness and gentleness had touched her profoundly. But for everyone's safety, never seeing each other again was the best outcome for both of them. To celebrate Kanako's narrow escape, They went out for a proper celebration. Kanako slept more soundly than she ever had before, but the ordeal wasn't entirely over. Now came the test of their acting skills. First, a call came from Takeo's colleague, asking why he hadn't shown up for work. Kanako had already prepared her story and brushed it off smoothly. But then, Takeo's mother-in-law arrived at the door, demanding to know where he was. Kanako tearfully claimed she had no idea. Takeo had left Saturday morning and never returned. The bank also uncovered Takeo's embezzlement of client funds, just as everything seemed to be unfolding as expected. Akiko's arrival sent Kanako into a complete panic. She demanded to know if Kanako was aware that Takeo had been murdered. It turned out that on the night of his death, Takeo had called his sister. Takeo had told his sister he felt like he was going to be killed. Kanako's nervous expression was impossible to hide as she looked at the phone Akiko handed her. It turned out to be a false alarm. Takeo's mention of being killed had been meant figuratively, but Akiko had seen Kanako's panicked expression. She had always suspected Takeo's disappearance wasn't straightforward. From colleagues, she learned Takeo had always been meticulous at work, and with a promotion imminent, his future looked bright. How could he risk his entire life for a small sum of company funds? But no matter how much Akiko suspected, without evidence, it was useless. The next day, the bank summoned Takeo's family and presented photos of him stealing customer funds. Takeo's mother looked at the photos and immediately recognized this was not her son, though the resemblance was uncanny. A mother's instinct never fails. Despite her insistence, everyone dismissed her as simply unable to accept reality. With overwhelming evidence before them, the bank concluded Takeo had absconded with the funds. Bank officials announced they would make this outcome public. Hearing this, Kanako quietly breathed a sigh of relief. To celebrate escaping this nightmare, she invited Miho on a trip. Kanako remained oblivious to Akiko's continued vigilance. Upon their return from the trip, Akiko ambushed them directly below their building. Despite her investigations, Akiko still refused to accept the conclusion that Takeo had absconded. After much deliberation, Akiko identified a crucial piece of evidence. The entire residential complex was equipped with surveillance cameras. Reviewing the footage would reveal the truth. Hearing Akiko's words, both girls grew tense. To avoid suspicion, they had no choice but to accompany Akiko to the security office. Fortunately, since Akiko lacked access permissions, the guards couldn't retrieve the footage for her. Kanako quietly breathed a sigh of relief. Her strange behavior only deepened Akiko's suspicions, yet Akiko dared not rashly contact the police. If her brother truly had fled, reporting it might only harm him further. Left with no other option, Akiko sought out a private investigator. The next day, a worried Kanako returned to the security office, only to learn Akiko had used connections to view the footage. Takeo's figure was nowhere to be seen in the Saturday recordings. Hearing this, Kanako instantly collapsed to the floor. She urgently summoned Miho to devise a countermeasure. She had told everyone Takeo left on Saturday morning. How could she possibly justify this lie now? The clever Miho had a sudden flash of insight and devised a plan to cover up the lie. She suggested claiming Takeo had an affair outside the marriage. In reality, Takeo had been staying out late frequently lately. You lied about him leaving on Saturday because you feared revealing this would damage your husband's image. Fortunately, Akiko's attention was entirely focused on Saturday and she hadn't checked the Friday night surveillance. Kanako had just instructed the security office not to show Akiko any more footage, citing privacy concerns. In just 2 more weeks, the Friday night surveillance would be erased. By then, no matter how suspicious Akiko became, it would be too late. Perhaps heaven had mercy on Kanako. The private investigator Akiko hired, through analysis, accidentally stumbled upon a story that perfectly matched the lie Kanako had prepared. He suggested Takeo's disappearance was likely connected to a woman. Perhaps Takeo had been seduced by a woman and impulsively fled with the money. Upon hearing this, Akiko rushed to check the surveillance footage near the bank. She unexpectedly discovered Miho appearing beside her brother. But the person in the footage wasn't her brother at all, it was Eiji. Thus, Akiko was completely led astray, convinced Miho was the woman her brother had cheated with. Later, she confronted Miho with the surveillance photo, convinced she'd uncovered the truth. Miho secretly rejoiced and played along, confirming Akiko's suspicion. The next moment, Akiko declared with absolute certainty that her brother had returned to Japan. Miho looked utterly shocked. It turned out Akiko had accidentally spotted her brother during her daytime investigation, though she'd lost track of him. She was certain it was Takeo. Miho's heart raced with turmoil. She knew Takeo would never return. Could the person Akiko saw be Eiji, who had left the country? Akiko demanded Miho reveal Takeo's whereabouts. Miho froze, unsure how to respond. Fortunately, Mrs. Lee intervened and led Miho away. Meanwhile, Kanako's eyes widened in shock, because Eiji, who had left the country impersonating her husband, had actually returned. The reason? He couldn't forget Kanako after coming back. This time, he had his own passport. He wanted to return and confess his feelings to Kanako, but Kanako's heart was filled only with panic. Seeing Kanako's silence, Eiji didn't press her. Instead, he said he'd come back tomorrow. Worried, Kanako returned home and was about to tell Miho about this, only for Miho to speak first. She suspected Eiji had already returned to Japan. The urgent priority was to find him immediately and get him out of the country. If Akiko found Eiji first, they were finished. At that moment, Kanako, who had never known the care of a partner, felt herself wavering. She recalled Eiji's confession. Deep down, it seemed she truly harbored a faint longing to live with him, so she tentatively asked Miho, what if Eiji refused to return? Miho replied that if he refused to return, they should make him disappear altogether. Kanako almost told her that Eiji had already come looking for her, but seeing Miho's serious expression, the words died on her lips. The next day, Eiji found Kanako again, watching the bustling street. Kanako panicked. If Akiko saw them, the consequences would be unimaginable. She had no choice but to check into a hotel room and beg Eiji to return to China, never to set foot on this land again. Eiji didn't know about Kanako killing Takeo, so he hadn't grasped the gravity of the situation. Seeing Eiji's gentle, kind eyes, Kanako's heart wavered once more, but Miho was burning with urgency. She had to get Eiji out of the country before Akiko found him. She enlisted Mrs. Lee to track down Eiji's residence, but found no trace of him. Eiji's fellow villagers seemed deliberately evasive. Yet Akiko, relentless as death, found Miho again. She demanded Miho reveal Takeo's whereabouts. Miho had no choice but to lie, saying Takeo, consumed by guilt over embezzled funds, refused to see anyone. Left with no options, Akiko sought out Kanako. By now, she had completely dismissed any suspicion toward Kanako. She even began to see Kanako as a victim, abandoned by her own brother. To uncover Takeo's whereabouts, she planned to review the surveillance footage from Friday, but she needed Kanako's consent. Kanako, however, seemed completely unfazed. She promised she would handle the negotiations with the security office herself. It turned out that 3 weeks had already passed since that incident. The security office's surveillance footage had been automatically erased. Now their only evidence of the crime was gone. Miho sighed in relief upon hearing this. Then she pulled out a cake from her bag. Even under such immense pressure, Miho still remembered Kanako's birthday. To help Kanako escape her misery, she'd risked her own safety to commit a serious crime. Thinking of this, Kanako felt both moved and guilty, because even now, she was still hiding the truth about Eiji from her. With this realization, Kanako made up her mind. The next day, she returned to the hotel and confessed to Eiji that she had killed her husband, Takeo. Now she was a murderer bearing the weight of a life. Therefore, she couldn't be with Eiji and pleaded for him to return to China immediately. But Eiji's feelings for Kanako seemed to surpass all expectations. He proposed taking Kanako back to China with him. That way, they could escape this situation, though her heart yearned to flee far away with Eiji. What would become of Miho if she left? She could only turn away and stand firm in her resolve, though deeply reluctant. Eiji chose to respect Kanako's decision. He walked over and gently embraced her from behind. At that moment, Miho's figure appeared downstairs at the hotel. Kanako's recent behavior had struck Miho as unusual. Driven by curiosity, Miho had followed her all the way. Opening the door, she witnessed the two embracing. Seeing Miho's shocked expression, Kanako felt a pang of guilt. Momentarily at a loss for words, Miho slapped Kanako hard across the face. No explanation from Kanako could ease Miho's hurt and rage. She decided to sever all ties with Kanako. The next morning, The doorbell rang. She assumed Kanako had come to apologize, but when she opened the door, Akiko stood there instead. Ignoring Miho's protests, Akiko barged straight inside. Seeing no sign of her younger brother Takeo, she said nothing more. Instead, she asked Miho for a glass of water. Miho turned to pour Akiko a glass of water, but Akiko left without even taking a sip. Miho was utterly baffled, unable to fathom why. Then, unexpectedly, Eiji called her, asking to meet. After they arrived at the agreed location, Eiji expressed his apologies. "My sudden appearance put you both in danger," he said. He explained that this entire situation was his own reckless decision, unrelated to Kanako. Therefore, he earnestly pleaded with Miho to book him a flight back home. This time, he vowed to keep his promise and never set foot in this country again. Miho was relieved that Eiji had come to his senses. Upon returning home, she immediately booked his ticket. After informing Eiji of the news, the weight lifted from Miho's heart. Yet, she completely failed to notice the strange device hidden beneath the leaves of the potted plant. The next day, Miho arrived at the airport at the agreed time. While searching for Eiji, she unexpectedly spotted Akiko. She seemed to be searching for something as well. Spotting Eiji waiting at the gate, Akiko rushed over and embraced him in excitement, clearly mistaking him for her younger brother Takeo. Eiji recalled Kanako mentioning she had killed Takeo. Sensing something was wrong, he tried to leave but accidentally dropped his passport. Akiko unexpectedly discovered an unfamiliar name on the passport. Eiji snatched the passport and fled. Seeing this, Miho quickly hid. The sharp-witted Akiko finally pieced everything together. Meanwhile, Miho also ran back home. After the airport incident, Miho was certain Akiko had tapped her phone. Carefully recalling events, she suddenly remembered Akiko's strange behavior the previous day. She hurriedly knelt at the same spot and searched. Sure enough, she found the listening device hidden under the leaves. Furious, she smashed it to pieces. Despite all her precautions, Akiko had outmaneuvered her. This tiny listening device was destined to be the final blade that sliced through the lies. Akiko returned to the detective agency. Even though she had guessed Eiji was impersonating Takeo, she still didn't know Takeo's whereabouts. The detective suggested searching Friday's surveillance footage for clues. Late at night, Akiko and the detective returned to the monitoring room. It turned out the detective had restored the footage through technical means. Akiko finally saw the truth. On Friday night, her brother returned home. 2 hours later, Kanako and another person were seen dragging a suitcase into the elevator. The footage switched to the basement where they loaded the suitcase into a car and drove off. But when they returned, the suitcase they had taken was nowhere to be found. At this moment, Akiko finally guessed her brother's fate. Calmly, she confronted Kanako and recounted the truth word for word. Then she told Kanako, "I can let you die with the truth. If you're arrested, the media will swarm. Your family won't be able to leave the house." But Kanako, usually timid, was unusually resolute this time. She firmly declared she hadn't killed Takeo. Just yesterday, Kanako had unexpectedly discovered she was pregnant. No matter how despicable the child's father was, the unborn child was innocent. She couldn't bear the thought of her mother-in-law raising the child to become another Takeo after she went to prison, so she violently shook off Akiko's hand. Akiko, enraged, pinned her against the wall. But Kanako remained eerily calm. "Even though Takeo was your closest brother," she said, "to me, he was nothing but a demon who abused me daily." No matter how distraught Akiko became, the surveillance footage couldn't be used as evidence, so Kanako rushed to find Miho. At this point, there was no time for arguments. What they'd once competed in was strategy. Now it was a race against time. If Akiko went to the police station to report it, it was only a matter of time before the police traced their car's movements that night and found Takeo's body. If they could escape overseas, there might still be a sliver of hope. After packing their bags, they decided to head straight to the airport. But as soon as they stepped onto the street, a police car blocked their path. It was the police Akiko had called. Under the pretext of assisting with the investigation, the officers took Kanako away. At the station, under the interrogation of a seasoned detective, Kanako, already feeling guilty, was on the verge of breaking down. Just as she was about to confess everything, a lawyer suddenly arrived. After the lawyer intervened, Kanako was granted a 24-hour bail. It turned out Miho had enlisted the help of the well-connected Mrs. Lee to find this top-tier lawyer in such a short time. Though they only had 24 hours of freedom, Mrs. Lee remained completely unflustered. By now, Mrs. Lee also knew about the two women's crime, yet she showed neither contempt nor blame. She had said before that killing a man who abuses his family is not at all excessive. Mrs. Lee turned and pulled out 2 plane tickets. They were for the earliest flight to Shanghai, China. The next morning, attached were contact details for her relatives. Faced with this kind, principled Chinese woman, the two were at a loss for how to express their gratitude. Mrs. Lee stated that protecting friends was simply her duty. After an affectionate embrace, the most critical moment arrived. Early the next morning, the pair arrived at the airport to wait. Unexpectedly, they spotted Akiko and the detective. Seeing the tablet in the detective's hands, they realized they'd been followed by Akiko. Akiko followed the location on her screen, searching relentlessly, but the red dot kept shifting. After circling around for ages, they suddenly realized Kanako was nowhere to be found. Instead, there was Eiji. It turned out that just moments ago, while Kanako and Eiji were at a loss, Eiji had rushed to their aid. Ever since escaping the airport last time, he'd been hiding in the shadows, tracking Akiko. All the while, he'd been looking for an opportunity to help them. He took the tracked phone and handed them tickets to another airport. Eiji hoped they'd have a chance to visit his hometown someday. Then he kept stalling for time. By the time Akiko realized she'd been tricked, Kanako was already on her way to the other airport. Meanwhile, the police called Akiko to inform her they'd found her brother's body, though she'd braced herself mentally. Hearing the news was still unbearable for Akiko. After regaining her composure, she deduced that Kanako and her companion must be headed for Shanghai. Only 2 airports offered flights to Shanghai that morning. If they weren't here, they must have gone to the other airport. She immediately relayed this information to the police and rushed to the other airport with a detective. Meanwhile, Miho and Kanako had already passed through security and were steadily walking toward freedom. Just then, Akiko arrived. Seeing the flight display showing cancelled, Akiko knelt on the ground in agony. She refused to let the murderer slip away like this, as she wept in anguish. A large contingent of police officers arrived. The film ends here. The director leaves an open-ended conclusion. Will these 2 women, pursuing freedom and friendship, ultimately escape? Every viewer will have their own answer in their heart.